say I found it really telling that you champion people like Ronald Reagan and Dwight Eisenhower as folks who didn't, bang this racial drum like Donald Trump does. And I think for a lot of communities of color, look, they may have been more articulate and less clumsy than our current president, but absolutely their words were just as damaging. Their policies were just as damaging. You talk about Ronald Reagan. He racialized the debate on welfare. He painted the black woman as the face of welfare queen, even though more white people were on welfare at that time then in the 80s and still now. He campaigned on abolishing affirmative action. He wanted to roll back civil rights policies. He's responsible for some of the gun laws as governor of California. Dwight Eisenhower, you say, didn't do these things as well. Dwight Eisenhower is known for telling the Supreme Court these poor white folks are good people. They just don't want their white daughter sitting next to oversized Negroes. Those are his words. So the fact that those two people are your champions to show that, these are good, righteous Republicans who never, perpetuated those racial tropes, it seems a bit of a disconnect to me when you say those things, and I imagine to a lot of people of color across the country.
Would you believe you're not master of your own destiny, that agency is not
Many people aren't masters of their own destiny.
Well, I think it's a toxic philosophy. I don't think
I think it's an accurate philosophy, and I think, with respect, I think your outlook on this is a bit myopic and based solely on your experience and doesn't extend the intellectual debate with people who haven't had your history. There are economically disadvantaged white people in this country. I think the reasons why they're economically disadvantaged are very different from the reasons why some communities of color are disadvantaged. And I think it's really dangerous to look at the current state of this country without looking at it through the context of historical systems that put those people in that position. You call that victimization, but I call that reality. I mean, first, I would quote the Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett and say that thank God the Democratic majority can walk and chew gum at the same time. To say that them focusing on impeachment takes away from these discussions is just a false narrative. That's not true. And, you were saying that the American people should feel relieved. Forgive me if I don't feel relieved. To Natasha's point, I think there are a lot of unanswered questions we still don't know. We haven't proven that this president didn't collude. What we have is a summary from Bill Barr about the report. I think if Republicans are so confident that this report will show that it was such a witch hunt, then they should make it public and let the American people make that decision. That will be in Congress's hands, which I hope they pursue. I also think that when you get to some of the policy discussions that are happening, look, if you only focus on what the American people care about, you might have hearings on reality TV shows and Dunkin' Donuts. I mean, you have to do the business of the American people, and everybody doesn't know the minutia of government. That doesn't absolve members of Congress from pursuing issues when a foreign adversary clearly tried to impact our election on multiple occasions. We are the rising majority of this country. And so every conversation we have around politics center white people, the shrinking majority. So that gives the false impression to black and brown voters, maybe your vote, maybe your voice doesn't count. We're asking all these people, all black people across this country, to vote, to participate in the system. I can't be mad at the person that says, wait a second, you want me to trust the system that imprisoned my family, that poisoned my community, that keeps my kids in a dilapidated school, that keeps my family in redline communities? Now I'm supposed to trust that my vote is going to count?
How do you get beyond
You have to ask people. I'm not asking you to believe in the system. I'm asking you to believe in you, brother. I'm asking you to believe in you, sister. Don't believe in this system. We can be the architects of whatever the next phase of this democracy is. It's incumbent upon us to do that. The past year, what we've noticed, I think it has highlighted the need for newsroom diversity. So the New York Times that you referenced, one of the things that I found concerning that we wrote about at the Beat DC is that they have an all-white team covering this administration. So when you have that, you are going to miss some perspectives, and you are going to miss some points of view that I think they're missing, and they have gone out of their way to understand this mysterious Trump voter. And I'll tell you, I'm a black woman. I grew up between Ohio and Georgia. I understand very well the Trump voter. I don't necessarily need them to dedicate an entire editorial page to help us understand. And I think on the other side, though, that we have to, as citizens, is putting this burden on citizens to understand democracy better. This is a privilege and a responsibility that we have to understand. So I would say for the average, John Q out there, all of us on this panel, we get paid to sit around and dissect and talk about the minutia of the Beltway. The average person doesn't. And so when you hear and talk to people who are focused on the hashtag, for example, the hashtag reclaiming my time, but when you talk to the average person and say, but how do you feel about Secretary Mnuchin completely ignoring Congress Congresswoman Maxine Waters. They don't know what you're talking about. So I think this situation has highlighted the need for citizens to be more engaged, for politicians to be held accountable, and for newsrooms to make a better effort in diversity. We have a president of the United States who is an unindicted co-conspirator in multiple crimes. He's been implicated in threatening and surveilling a member of the U.S. government. And this is why the senators don't want to call witnesses, because they have never developed a spine to stand up to this president. And when you hear from John Bolton, they will be forced to confront things that they have run from. And this is very consistent with his behavior throughout his entire presidency. Remember, former White House counsel Don McGahn said that this president is asking me to do some crazy, you know what, sugar, honey, iced tea. They didn't want to hear from him either. So I think we have to start focusing on the crimes that are committed, not what this asinine president will tweet out, because we've already seen as evidence as the past 2 years, 3 years of chaos, trying to cover every ridiculous thing he does is like trying to catch confetti. I also think the parallels between Jared Kushner and MBS are quite striking to me. I remember when they rolled out MBS as this new Saudi Arabia. He's letting women drive. He's creating this new country. I was even a little fascinated by who he was. And I talked to a very senior official who was at the State Department during the Obama administration, and she said, don't believe the hype. This guy is shifty, and he's not to be trusted. And so I think the fact that Jared Kushner has kind of been his ambassador and the person pushing him to this with this administration, the parallels between the two, that he's the son-in-law and secretary of all the things, and then you have him with MBS, you know, who's not yet king, and how they're kind of working and being each other's advocate is leery. And I think to your point, you do have to look into what are the financial entanglements here with this arms deal that they've only produced $14 billion of this huge art of the deal that this president has claimed that he's getting. I think it's questionable. Look, Joe Biden was supposed to be the great white hope that would energize the Midwest white voters, the euphemism that the media has for white voters, the suburban voters. And so I don't think that she adds anything to the ticket. And when you look at, there was a report from the Reflective Democracy campaign that found that Black women were overwhelmingly increased as candidates and as voters. So when you had a Black woman on the ticket at the state, local, and federal level, they accounted for a disproportionate amount of the winners. So I think when election is so critical at this point, and there's so much riding on it, you need everything you can to energize the base and encourage people to cast a ballot when they're facing, Ari, an unholy trinity of things that will depress and suppress the vote. We've got GOP-led voter suppression. We've got foreign election interference that specifically targets Black voters. And now we have the fallout of COVID-19. So that unholy trinity really can wreak havoc on our democracy. And I think, you know, Black voters have been so traditionally brutalized throughout the history of the country that they're afraid to make demands, that there are so many people who feel like, well, don't make a lot of noise because we just need to win. But when we sit at the epicenter of political power, if not now, then when? So why not have Joe Biden help us help him, usher him over this finish line, because we are disproportionately the people who hold up this candidacy, this party, and this democracy.
It have mattered.
No, it wouldn't. And I would take a bit of an issue, Yasmin, and say that everyone was not expecting this president to address this nation and the racial inequality that has historically plagued this country. I think we got exactly what we expected. This is not the first time that Donald Trump has fallen short of being a leader. He has routinely called for violence and stoked the racial tensions in this country, even as far back as on the campaign trail. In 2016, he encouraged people to behave violently. He encouraged someone, if you see them about to throw a tomato, knock the hell out of them. He encouraged police violence. He encouraged people to commit violence at his rallies. We saw even one of the MAGA attendees sucker punched an attendee. And so, and recently in an interview with Breitbart, he suggested that the people with guns are all on his side, the military, the police, the bikers. So I don't think that America expects anything from Donald Trump other than what we have routinely gotten. I think it's been an unfortunate characterization and attempt by a lot of people in the in some certain mainstream media outlets to normalize this kind of asinine and violent behavior. And that's one of the things that has to stop. And that's been something that has plagued this country since 1619. And so it is a bit frustrating, Yasmin, I'll tell you, when I routinely hear well-intentioned people say, this is not who we are. These type of violent revolutions are as American as apple pie and as old as the Battle of Jamestown. And until we stop perpetuating a false narrative narrative about who this country is and confront the reality about historic white supremacy systems that have helped get us here, I'm afraid to see that history will continue to repeat itself. So, and here's the thing about this field, nobody's generally exciting, right? You know, everybody's kind of like, all right, you're the person who will take. And I think that's because so many people still have an Obama hangover. They still want to be excited about a candidate. They still want somebody to give you that feeling you get on Sunday morning from a Baptist preacher, and that's not going to happen. So I have to say, I really think this field is going to hedge heavily on the second person on the ticket, their VP pick. And I know that can ring true of desperation if somebody does it, but it would be a bold move for any of these candidates to come out and say, you know what, I'm going to pick the candidate or person X as my running mate. And it's not unprecedented. You remember Ted Cruz did this in 2016 with Carly Fiorina. Well, we see how well that worked out. That's not the best example. But in 1952, Senator Bob Taft did this with General MacArthur. You see a pattern of behavior where they say, you know, well, this crime that he committed never happened. And then they go to, well, it happened, but so what? This has been consistent throughout Trump's presidency. So again, if you are a supporter of democracy, if you are a supporter of patriotism, then certainly you should want acts such as these examined in Congress, a co-equal branch of government. If Joe Biden thinks he is Joe Obama, he is wrong. He actually does need to make inroads with this community. And what we saw Super Tuesday, Black voters, as we always do, made a pragmatic decision. It's not that Black voters are so overly enthusiastic about Joe Biden, but he looked like the candidate who was, one, the most likely to get elected, that perhaps the rest of the country might vote in their interest and vote for him, and two, would cause the least harm to the Black community, despite some of his questionable and problematic record. I agree with your point, but I also think we can go one step further and say that he really, truly doesn't understand campaign finance laws. I mean, I don't think this is feigning ignorance.
Understand or doesn't care?
Both. I really do think it's both. I don't think he's feigning ignorance here. Again, this is his first job in government. So I do think he's, you know, learning trial by error. One thing that he said in the Fox News interview that was another clear lie is, of course, now he hardly knows Michael Cohen and he wasn't his fixer. Well, you could have fooled me, because he certainly tried to fix the situation with Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal. And long before this ever happened, how they even met is he was a fixer in one of the issues that he had with one of his tenants in one of his apartment buildings. So this is clearly someone he's close with. And yet again, he flips and tries to put distance there when obviously the people have seen over the years that's not the case. And I don't think his supporters will ever hold him accountable for any of these lies. Okay, well, they're obviously both more than athletes. They're tax-paying citizens well within their right to express their concerns. It's shared by many Americans in this country and what they're doing. But I think what Laura Ingraham did was highlight her own ignorance. There's been a long, rich tradition of athletes weighing in on political issues. So this is the same woman who would have told Muhammad Ali to shut up and fight when he was protesting the Vietnam War, or told John Carlos and Tommy Smith to shut up and run during the 1968 Olympics. So she sounds ridiculous. But if you know what she said, Joy, she said that this is dangerous because there are children and some adults who will believe this. And so that's really the fear. They don't want our athletes speaking conscience and truth into our communities, because then that will incite a movement, and that's not what they want. Moreover, the descendant of colonizers does not get to tell the descendant of slaves what they can talk about and when they can talk about it. In Wakanda, she's not allowed to speak.
Hey, okay, Wakanda forever. And you know,
I want to talk to you about white nationalism. The rise in domestic terrorism by these extremists is a serious problem for our country. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, hate groups are at an all-time high, up nearly 30% since 2016. And every time one of these tragedies strikes, a chorus of personalities and lawmakers come out and decry, this is not who we are. But isn't it though? This country was not founded on peace and kindness. It was taken with blood and fury. It wasn't built on equity and equality. It was built on the backs of the kidnapped and the enslaved. Yet, despite everything our people have endured, we are still patriots because of the promise of what America could be. But that fragile promise has grown even more frail under the Trump administration. This president refuses to acknowledge white nationalism as a threat and instead focuses on what he calls radical Islamic terrorism, even though most of the American terrorist victims on his watch have been killed by white nationalists. And Republicans have never really chin-checked this president for this behavior. Fortunately, there are some lawmakers serving right here in Congress today who share these white nationalist beliefs. And their racist policies can be a lot more damaging than fools with a bullhorn. So political apathy is not an option. It only helps the oppressor. And if we've learned anything this week, it's that there's only one thing to say to anyone who means to oppress us. Not today. we'll see you in 2020. This is analysis coming from the chatter class, okay? The chatter class, or the children of the chatter class, people who have this very myopic outlook. So when you read these things, you do have to consider, well, who's the narrator? Who are the people telling this story? And they don't reflect this panel. And newsflash, voters are looking a lot more like this panel. And let the chatter class know, we got next. You all have missed the mark too many times, and it should also be a sign to media that they need to be more inclusive in their coverage, because as long as it's very privileged, white, myopic views talking to other white voters, then they're going to keep missing the mark. So by evolution or by force, we have to make that happen.